Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for Elder Protective Services continuing to function in a pandemic. My name is Charlotte Hoff, and I'm the Communications and Training Coordinator here at MOVA. I'm just going to go over some logistics before passing this over to our presenters for today. Just as a reminder, this is a Zoom webinar, so you cannot be seen or heard as audience members, but you can see the presenters, ASL interpreters, and presentation. There will be time at the end for questions. So if you have questions during the presentation, please put them in the Q&A function and we will get to all of them at the end. So you can put questions in as you have them and we'll answer them all at the end. So as I mentioned, we do have ASL interpretation and captioning available during today's workshop. To see the closed captions, go to the bottom of the screen and click on the arrow, the up arrow next to closed caption and choose show subtitle. If you're having trouble seeing the ASL interpreters, closed captions, or any other tech issues today, please use the chat function to message either myself or my colleague Brenna Chase, and we'll be happy to assist you. If you don't see our names to individually message, you can message all panelists, and we'll be able to help you from there. Jonathan Fielding has worked in the Elder Protective Services field since 1993, and since 2001, he has been a Protective Services Regional Manager at the Executive Office of Elder Affairs. In this position, he has been involved with writing policy clarification, revising the program regulations, establishing a 24/7 central intake unit, and training many people and programs across the Commonwealth on elder abuse and reporting. Taryn Lee Tergen has worked in Elder Protective Services since 2005 and started her position as the Assistant Director of Protective Services at the Executive Office of Elder Affairs in October of 2020. While working in Protective Services, Taryn was a master trainer for the Protective Network in basic training in Protective Services, as well as interviewer for decisional abilities. She has also had the opportunity to provide community training to a variety of people and organizations. Welcome, Taryn and Jonathan. Thank you both for being here with us today, and I'll turn it over to you guys now.
Thank you. We're actually going to do this in two parts. The first is going to be more of an overview of the program. We haven't done trainings with this group for several years, I think. And also there were some fairly significant regulatory changes in 2017. So we do want to highlight some of that for you and then move into the second part, how in the world we survived during this pandemic and kept our program going. As you heard, my name is Jonathan Fielding, and unfortunately I'm approaching 20 years at the state and close to 30 in Protective Services. Taryn joins me today, and I've done many trainings with Taryn, and she's been helpful in establishing the central intake unit, but also in doing trainings across the state. As I said, I want to present kind of an overview of the aging population, basic information and philosophies of our program, types of abuse, kind of what contributes to the abuse, the program process, which has changed a little bit for reporting for those who haven't reported in a while, and then also outline confidentiality and notification. You're going to notice in this first part that there are no agency or staff names. We haven't given you phone numbers, statistical information. We did provide an agency listing as well as phone numbers to your office, so that's something that you can get from Charlotte. The reason that we did that is changes happen too frequently, whether it's with intake numbers because of COVID or agencies merging, and we didn't want to have to change a PowerPoint every 6 months as our agencies change. We don't deal with all abuse, despite what the community sometimes thinks. We do take reports at our hotline for anybody over 60, and they will funnel it, or the local agencies will funnel it where it goes. But across the state, and Massachusetts is somewhat unique, where we kind of separated out who deals with abuse. Under 18 is DCF, and then any age in a licensed healthcare facility or by a healthcare provider would go to public health. Disabled Persons Protection Commission does 18 to 59, and then we do 60 and over, as well as abuse by personal care attendants. I want to clarify, there are always exceptions to the rule. We sometimes see more exceptions than not. And my philosophy has always been, I don't want to see somebody fall through the cracks. So what we encourage you to do is, if the person or the individual is over 60, to file the report with our system, and then we'll determine where it's best handled at that point in time. We do have not just in Massachusetts, but overall an aging population, close to about 35 million. And then by the middle of the 21st century, we're talking probably 80 plus million people will be age 65 and older. 1 in 5 Americans are going to be considered a senior by the year 2030. And chart may have changed a little bit since we had it done back in 2015, but this just gives you a general idea of, in about the next 10, 15 years, what the communities in Massachusetts are going to be like in terms of the older adult population. And most of the state, you can see, is going to be 30% or above older adults, whether it's 60 or 65 that you're looking at. We think our program's the most important program. I don't think Taryn would disagree with me on that. But Elder Affairs does have quite a few programs that we deal with. So again, you may not deal with protective services. You may be dealing more with home care, the Ombudsman program, or even something along the lines of long-term services and supports, which would be more your Medicaid type programs. Our office for protective services is actually quite small. Again, compared to others, we subcontract out for the protective services, guardianship, etc. In our office, we have a director, Taryn as the assistant director. There are only 3 of us as regional managers. We have 1 person who does QA for the state and a special project support. Usually it's grants. None of us like writing grants or dealing with grants, so we kind of dump them on her. We have currently 19 protective services programs. And again, that number is subject to change at any point in time as agencies merge. They all have either a program director or a program manager, supervisors, and varying degrees or numbers of workers. Smallest is anywhere from 3 to 5 workers for a program. And I think the largest is probably Merrimack Valley, which is, I think, between 20 and 25 protective workers and 7 supervisors. So, again, depending on the caseload sizes, depending on the number of reports, the programs vary in size. We do still do or operate and oversee guardianship programs in the community, as well as money management. And as you heard at the beginning, the central intake unit, we've always had an elder abuse hotline, primarily did reports after hours. And about 4 years ago, they gave up that contract, and fiscally we needed to make some changes. And so we put in place the central intake unit, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. Goals of our program have not changed in 30 years. It's to prevent, remedy, or eliminate the abusive situations. I do want to caution you as community professionals, we're not ones who can wave our magic wands and fix everything. There are a variety of reasons. And I know for me, it's been one of the frustrating things where I want to fix everything. And we have to realize that we can't, because we're dealing oftentimes with competent adults who don't want to make changes. But certainly we will make those attempts to remedy the situation as much as we can. As I keep getting closer and closer to 60, this is more and more uncomfortable for me, but elder in Massachusetts is defined as 60 and over. Each state's a little different in how they define their program and the age limit. Usually what we see, and again, I said there are exceptions to that rule, usually what we see though are community-based situations where the abuse is by family, friends, neighbors, or acquaintances. You may still hear the terminology ongoing personal relationship thrown out. Don't like it. It's not in the regulations. It's not something that we're really comfortable with because it's hard to define. So really, if you're not sure who the abuser is or kind of the relationship between the elder and this alleged abuser, you're better off filing the report and then letting our programs make that determination. Probably one of the more confusing slides I think we'll throw out to you in terms of program jurisdiction. Most of what we see are going to be in the community, whether it's private homes, elder housing, homeless elders, congregate. We're seeing a lot more of unlicensed homes or what will be called maybe VA group homes that are not operated or licensed by the VA. and unfortunately fall under us. Assisted living facilities are really kind of expensive housing authorities, and unless it's abuse by staff at that facility, abuse between residents is our program. And hospitals and nursing homes, which I'll clarify in a moment. The DMH DDS group homes, certainly we're not going to go into Lemuel Shattuck and investigate abuse, but there are exceptions in terms of group homes in the community. If somebody leaves the group home for a visit at a family member's house and is abused, then that's actually ours. DMH and DDS don't have any jurisdiction kind of outside their staffing and their group home. So those are things that we would look at, and we try not to. We do get calls about elders who are in prison being abused. Not a lot, and we won't go into prisons, obviously. As I said before, mostly family, friends, non-strangers, guardian or conservator, caretakers, and then, as I said, other facility residents, which would be more your assisted living facilities. Something more than a one-time incident, if an elder is walking down the street and somebody jumps out and assaults them, that's not ours. It's a stranger abuse. We'd be looking, again, for that family or friends. Neglect by staff, we're not going to cover. I want to caution you again on that, because you may hear that somebody is a staff member at an assisted living facility and there's somebody who goes in and services elders, but they're not actually a staff member of that facility. And so unless they're under DPH, they would be our program. Hospitals, hopefully you don't hear of nurses, doctors, or staff abusing somebody in a hospital, but that would obviously go to the Department of Public Health. If family and friends go into a hospital setting, we need to ensure their safety. So if they're abusing the elder or creating problems, that we need to know about that. Nursing and rest homes are a little bit more difficult because there are a variety of factors that play into it, which is why we generally say file the report with our system, and then it will get funneled out, or maybe it's dual jurisdiction where both protective and another state agency is involved. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to Taryn, who's going to start on components of the program and run you through some of what we look at.
Thank you, Jonathan. So we talked a little bit about the central intake unit, which does receive all of the reports statewide 24/7, and then filters them to those agencies that we talked about that have the protective service units. We also have a 24/7 online reporting portal that can be used to report elder abuse. We run those state guardianships programs. We have a certain number of statewide guardianship slots that when an agency feels the need for a guardian or a conservator be put in place and there's no one else, we can look to see if one of those slots are available. Our money management program offers rep payee and bill payer services. And then we talked about those 19 designated PS agencies that do the screening, investigation, and the ongoing service component of protective services. So Jonathan said there's been some changes. It actually started with Mass General Law, Chapter 19A back in 1982. It actually only covered physical abuse, emotional and sexual abuse, and caretaker neglect. Slowly, more addendums were added, and work gave us the ability to look at more. Financial exploitation was added in 1990, and then 2004, we started looking at self-neglect. And Jonathan said, there were some regulation changes in 2017 that we will go over. Obviously, adding these different categories of abuse and neglect, steadily increased our numbers throughout that time. At least half of the reported substantiated allegations are self-neglect. So although that didn't get added until 2004, it is one of the biggest components of the protective service world. And as many reports as we do get, studies do still suggest that only 1 in 5 elder abuse situations actually get reported to the appropriate authorities. So our program philosophies haven't changed a whole lot. Obviously, self-determination is key. We mentioned earlier, these are competent elders. We sometimes want to fix everything, but we can't always do that. We have to look at their decisional versus functional capacity. When we talk about what is decisional capacity, can they make those decisions? Do they understand them? Has anybody deemed them to not be able to make those decisions? Obviously, we have to take a look at that because it's going to impact our investigation, how we gather information and provide, and it's going to have a big impact on the service provisions that we offer. Our program philosophy has always been least restrictive, most appropriate. We want to keep our older adults in their home as long as possible, so long as we can do it safely. So we have a few important program mandates. Confidentiality is a big one. Mandated reporter information, we'll get to it. There's a couple caveats, but really is always confidential. We're not going to tell the person you're calling about who you are and that you reported. That's a big one, which is funny because it's usually the first question we get is who called you, and we're not going to release that information. PS records themselves are not public records. There are ways, through regulations for them to be requested by certain parties, but they are not public records. So there is a process that has to happen before they are released. Our protective service workers themselves are mandated reporters, and they're going to report to the district attorney when appropriate. This is usually death due to abuse or neglect, and other allegations, sexual abuse, financial exploitation, things that meet the criteria. We also help a lot within the legal processes. We can get protective orders if we need to have someone evaluated, if we need to see someone safely. And we talked about a little earlier, guardianship and conservator, whether it's one of the state agencies or appointing somebody else in the elder's life. So this is all, we talked about this. This is everything we do. So it's physical abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse, financial exploitation, caretaker neglect, and that big one, which is self-neglect. We're going to talk a little bit about, what to look for and things we have to consider when we're investigating these different allegations. So with physical abuse, there are a few things we have to consider. We're going to look at the elder's physical condition. Are they able to, defend themselves, move around, get out if needed? We're going to look at the type and size of the injuries that are occurring, the situation under which they occurred, the emotional impact, how it affected the elder and their functioning, the potential for it to escalate. Is that person in the home? Do they have access? And again, injuries are not always needed for physical abuse. There can be threats. Some things are physical abuse, but might not leave a mark. So there's a lot of factors we have to consider. Some signs and symptoms to look for, for community members and mandated reporters are, those bruises and scratches, ligature marks, obviously human bite marks, patches of missing hair that could be from, pulling the hair out, unexplained bruising or scars, and usually injuries that just aren't consistent with the story that's being told. And we talked about earlier, injuries are not needed, so threats to harm are something to keep an eye out for as well. Emotional abuse, there must be a relationship. So there has to be an impact from the emotional abuse that's happening with the elder. I kind of joke about this all the time. I was a field worker for 10 years, when we would get a lot of reports on couples in their 90s that they're yelling at each other. But if they've been yelling back and forth at each other for all 70 years of their marriage, it might not rise to that level of emotional abuse because it might not have that correlation and impact on the elder's mental health. Again, lifestyle choices are not abuse. And, we have to take all of those factors into consideration. Signs and symptoms, some mental health changes, maybe some self-esteem changes, increased fear or anxiety in the elder. It can also cause, physical issues, elevated blood pressure, upset stomach, nauseousness, and behavioral changes, not eating, not sleeping, or not caring for themselves. Sexual abuse is, I truly believe, vastly underreported across the country. We don't get a whole lot of reports on sexual abuse, but sexual assault, rape, sexual misuse, or sexual exploitation, as well as threats of sexual abuse and or harmful genital practices. Harmful genital practices really includes any unwarranted or intrusive genital or rectal care, procedures that are unnecessary for the health and well-being, or inappropriate use of, a lot of times we see creams or medications or excessive scrubbing. It could sometimes be kind of well-intended where a family member or caregiver might not want, the family member to get urinary tract infections and they're trying to help, but it really can be harmful and painful to the elder, and that is considered sexual abuse. Some signs and symptoms to look for here. Again, any genital, rectal, mouth, or breast trauma, sexually transmitted disease, especially when the elder is not sexually active or able to consent to sexual activity. Frequent urinary tract infections. It can actually have the opposite impact with that cleaning process as well. Emotional trauma when bathed. So they were always fine with personal care. Now they're starting to not want it, refuse, maybe be a little behavioral while they're getting that personal care and bathing. And again, mental health changes, or sometimes the elder will just, disclose it and tell somebody what happened. Financial exploitation. So there's a lot that goes into this one. It can include gaining control over assets without consent. So taking over the banking, the power of attorney, all of those things without the elder being involved. Loss will vary from case to case. And there also has to be an impact. If somebody has $100,000 in the bank and somebody steals 100, it's not going to be as big of an impact if the elder only gets $200 a month and somebody steals 100. Obviously, there's a vast difference in impact on the elder at that time. Money goes quickly, and being able to get it back is difficult, if not impossible, in a lot of situations. So the impact can really be severe. It is often irreversible. Very little money is often recovered. The district attorney, because of that, sometimes they can't prosecute. It is very limited who gets prosecuted in that. Life savings can be gone, and there could be no way to recoup it. So the most important part is we need to stop it and try to prevent it before it's all gone, because detection and doing that early and catching it before it gets too far is the most important thing with a financial exploitation case. So some things to look for financial exploitation: unusual changes in financial activity. If you have an elder who only spends, $30 a week on average, all of a sudden they're going into the bank and taking out $200 at a time. If you see someone, who seems to be asserting control over the elder in terms of getting money, asking for money, saying you should take out more money or buy things or take out loans. Withdrawal changes, like I said, that $30 a week churns to $200 a week. Investment changes, and some kind of third-party involvement. Somebody gets in there and takes that control and all of a sudden has a power of attorney, and they're, doing everything they can to get the elder's money. And again, a lot of that can also be those deals that are too good to be true. You got to be careful about giving your personal information out over the phone. A lot of those times the money is absolutely going to be unrecoupable. So again, we really have to look at the impact of the financial exploitation. There can be there can be lack of food, lack of medical care, lack of services. They can't afford them. Ability to trust others. If they've been exploited or taken advantage of by family, trying to put a bill payer or a rep payee in can be difficult, because now they've lost their trust of somebody trying to help them. Fear and anxiety, and embarrassment and depression. Nobody wants to admit that their family member or friend has taken their money or taken advantage of them. And the environmental ones can be big. Utilities being turned off or behind, mortgage or rent being behind, which can, possibly cause loss of housing, inability to make safe and needed repairs to the home. And it can also impact placement in the long-term care facility and their long-term care needs. Caretaker neglect and self-neglect. So caretaker neglect is a failure or refusal of a caretaker to provide one or more of the essential for physical well-being, which results in serious physical injury and reasonable cause to believe that it will immediately result in serious physical injury. I want to point out that there's the failure or refusal. We do have, again, those couples in their 80s or 90s, if Mr. is 91 trying to care of Mrs. who's in her 80s, and he really is trying and doesn't want services in, but it's just not keeping her safe, we have to take a look at that. And again, a caretaker is the person responsible either through a family relationship, the fiduciary relationship, a contractual relationship, they're paying that person privately for care, or a voluntary assumption of duties. If you take on a full-time caretaker role, and then one day just decide you're not going to do it or you're going to stop doing it as much, we have to look at all of that. You've taken on the assumption of those duties. And then we have self-neglect, which again is a failure or refusal or an inability or often resistance of an elder to provide one or more of the necessities for physical or emotional well-being, which again results in serious physical or emotional harm or the risk of that emotional or physical harm. There is the same thing here. Sometimes they're really trying, they just need services and they don't know they can get them. So there's a resistance to have the services in or a failure to care for themselves that still covers under self-neglect. And this is where no caretaker exists or an elder with decisional capacity is refusing services. They just don't want to let that person in their home and it's leaving them at some form of risk. So these really, caretaker and self-neglect can really go hand in hand. So some of the stuff you're going to look for is, are they malnourished or dehydrated because they're not eating or buying enough food? Personal care starts to decline, medication mismanagement, failure to go to medical appointments, the home conditions, whether it be clutter or insects, rodents, lack of utilities, there's no heat, hot water, electricity, could be an unsafe environment, just a lack of appropriate services. They need somebody to help them and they don't have it. Financial mismanagement, if there's no one else involved and bills are unpaid, utilities are shut off, lack of appropriate supervision, and unsafe or dangerous behavior, very confused while driving, getting in accidents or getting lost. All of that are things to look for in both caretaker and self-neglect. So there's some contributing factors and some barriers. Social generational issues. There are a lot of, how things are looked at in terms of what's appropriate and what's not, what people's, duties are to help family and do all that. Medical issues can impact their ability to care for themselves. They could be cognitively strong, but physically they just can't do it. Cognitive issues on the flip side, where they could be physically strong enough to care for themselves, but cognitively can't, put it together. So again, there's a lot of things too that there's misunderstanding of the definitions and what we're looking at. And there's a lot of discomfort in talking about elder abuse. I know I've told a million people what I do, and some of them have honestly said, that's a thing. Like, they don't know, they don't want to talk about it, and then they kind of end the conversation. Sometimes barriers can be, there's language barriers. I mean, we do have a lot of, translation services. We're always going to talk to the elder in their own language and make sure they understand. People are fearful due to their immigration status. They don't want people to get involved because they're fearful of the repercussions. Cultural beliefs are always important. What's appropriate in one culture might not be in another, or might not be what the protective worker considers normal, but culturally it's appropriate and okay in their lives. Financial issues, ageism. Some people don't, I think that's a big one why sexual abuse is underreported. People don't think that it happens to people that are over 60. And all of these things can really be barriers and contributing factors to, any limitations we might have in protective. And I'm gonna, at this point, turn it back over to Jonathan.
I get walking through the process. You may be asking why in the world we went through stuff that maybe that maybe seem somewhat straightforward, especially, when you're dealing with domestic violence type cases. And there is a reason. You'll see as we start to get into talk about the pandemic and how we functioned or had to really reanalyze our program, a lot of that does end up fitting in. If you want to break it down, we have 4 steps to our program, running from the intake that gets filed through ongoing services when something is substantiated. For the intake, anybody can report, mandated or not mandated. And as I said before, reports are filed through the Elder Abuse Hotline. And what we've had since 2017 is also the ability to file online. As victim witness advocates in particular, I don't think you'd be considered mandated reporters unless you're a social worker. But certainly there's a long laundry list of those who should be reporting, whether it's a physician, medical personnel, police, fire, EMTs, and we do tend to see a lot of reports from them, as well as councils on aging. In the history of the program, I can tell you that nobody has ever been fined for not reporting, but that doesn't mean that you shouldn't report. As mandated reporters, they are required to file both verbally with the Elder Abuse Hotline or Central Intake Unit and submit that written form. If you submit the written form, that takes the place of both the verbal and the written form, or if you submit through the online system. So it's important to know, do you want to file online? Do you want to file verbally? And then what are you required to submit? And then the mandated reporter forms are sent directly to the local agencies. And I can say also that the online reports, when you file them, once you hit submit, they get dumped to the appropriate agency as well. Non-mandated, anybody can report, as we said. You just don't have the same requirements as mandated reporters do. Simply put, you file by calling the number I'm going to give you, or you file online. The number has not changed in the history of the program. We now, though, have a 24/7 hotline that will take reports. I can tell you staffing patterns are somewhat different overnight than they are during the day or even early evening. I will also throw out to you that if you have any problems with the Elder Abuse Hotline or Central Intake Unit, please let me know. I oversee the hotline, and they are constantly looking to improve. But I think it's also important to remember that they're a call center and they're trying to move things through, especially during busy times, as much as possible. If you do call in a report, be prepared to be on the phone and get asked a whole lot of questions. What I haven't added here is you're going to get asked a whole lot of COVID questions related to the elder, related to visiting the home, anybody else who might be in the home. They're also, because we've changed procedures somewhat and allowed agencies to do things electronically versus, mail or things like that, you're going to get extra questions about how to contact the reporter, what's their email address, and things like that. In general, though, the intake hasn't changed in the history of the program. We want as much information as you can give us. Certainly names, addresses, and ages help. If you don't have a date of birth, that's fine. I'm looking for examples more than anything else. If you're calling to say they're not getting medical treatment or medications, what is that? Because the specific information really helps our screeners identify level of risk. Not taking the insulin or mismedicating related to insulin or heart medication is very, very different than not taking, something to help them sleep at night. So again, having that information, having the information about interpreters is helpful. I think, and Taryn could probably agree with this, that going out to a home and not being able to communicate with an elder because they speak a different language is probably the most frustrating thing in the world, because it's slowing the process down. If we had known that information up front, it would be a whole lot more helpful for them. And certainly any safety issues in the home, not just COVID, but any safety issues going into the home, and what do our workers need to do? If you're going to file online, and I apologize for the light type, but the web address is here. It's easier if you just go to mass.gov and in the search window, type in reporting elder abuse and neglect, and it will bring you right to that site. You will come to this location, and I can't tell you on a daily basis how many people still don't follow this. We have mandated reporters filing verbal reports with the hotline, and then going in and thinking they're doing the mandated reporter form, and they're doing an online report. And we can't delete them. So, it's harder for us to deal with that situation. But certainly click on the right link if you can. If you're going to report, click on the report elder abuse. It will bring you to this. Click on it again, and you will see, and it's very, very different than our mandated reporter form. If you've actually seen that PDF document, this is what you would fill out for an online report. I do want to go through a couple of specifics because I want to caution you on it. The one other thing I will add to this online report is that it was done for those who don't want to spend a lot of time on the phone. So if a police officer wants to call in off shift or after hours or overnight and only has 5 minutes, It allows them to type in some of the basics and then actually attach an incident report, the police report if they want to. So they're not even having to type in a lot of narrative. They're just doing some of the basics, name, address, and things like that, and then saying see attached document, which allows them to do. The other caution with the online reporting feature that we found, particularly with like firefighters and EMTs, is they'll come back and they'll be at a computer, they'll start the process, and they'll get called out again. And it may happen several times. They get called out and they can never get back to doing the document. There's a timeout feature with the online report that if it's inactive for, I believe it's an hour, then it closes you out and you lose everything. So if you've typed in quite a bit of information, it can be frustrating. There is that timeout feature. When you're filing online, we don't want you filing online if it's an emergency situation. That doesn't mean that we don't have, individuals filing online for situations that are emergencies. Our agencies are pretty good about checking the queue on a regular basis to see if there's anything more significant. What happens is whether it's an online report or whether it's by phone, once it's submitted, the agency screeners and supervisors all get an email. And if it's filed through the online portal, it's automatically assigned a normal rating as opposed to an urgent rating. And so it may get missed for 24 to 48 hours, depending on when it's filed. So if it's an urgent situation, we would prefer you go through our hotline. The system cannot be used if you're filing anonymously. If you want to figure it out, you can file anonymously through the online portal. I'm not going to give you that information, but certainly many reporters have figured that out. You also must have the name. What's more important is the address and the town or city that the elder lives in, because it assigns it to the appropriate agency based on the address. So if you don't have an address, if you don't have a city or town, then we're not going to know what to do with it. And as I said before, for mandated reporters, it replaces the oral and written report if you do it online. Once you file, whether you hit submit or whether the central intake unit, you get off the phone with them, they finish typing it up, and they submit it, it goes to or gets dumped into the appropriate screening queue for one of the 19 agencies that I mentioned. They then are responsible for screening it in for investigation or screening out. They have a certain amount of time to screen things. It's frustrating sometimes with the online reports because they tend to have less information. We've done a good job of training the central intake unit workers to grill reporters for information because more information is easier for the screeners to make a decision. If they screen something in, they need to determine level of risk. So again, if we don't know what medications are being missed, it's hard for the central intake unit, for example, to determine level of risk. Just as we give our screeners risk matrices that help them identify low, medium, or high risk, when we went live with the central intake unit, we put together a similar matrix for them to determine whether it's normal, kind of normal priority or extreme priority, where they're going to call it out to the local agency. And without details, they're going to struggle making those decisions. And an intake may get screened out by the local agency if there's not enough information. So it's important that you get as much information as you can. We'll talk a little bit more about mandated reporters. You are going to get a call back before they screen out something for a mandated reporter, but as non-mandated reporters, you may or may not. They don't have to regulation-wise call mandated or non-mandated reporters back before they screen something out. If it's screened in, it goes to an investigation, and overall, our investigations have not changed. It's important to gather as much information as you can, assess risk, take legal action if you need to, whether it's going to court for bank documents, and then evaluating the information. Part of the problem is some of our parts of doing an investigation that are outlined in the regulations had to change or have slightly changed related to COVID over the last year, and we'll talk about that. But the main regulatory change for investigations is, and anybody who dealt with protective services prior to 2017 will remember that if we would go out to an elder's home, they said, I don't want you involved, leave me alone. And we think they have decisional capacity. It ended there. We weren't allowed to really proceed with an investigation. That has been taken out and replaced with elders have the right to refuse to participate, but they don't have the right to refuse an investigation. And so our staff, through what we're going to talk a little bit more about, are told to continue with that investigation, talk to appropriate collateral contacts and gather information, and still try and build rapport with an elder. The reason that we had that changed is we had too many agencies and workers walking away from situations they shouldn't without trying, to put it simply. So, we wanted to make sure that we did change that. So that was the big change related to investigations in our investigations. I like to think of it as putting a puzzle together. Putting a puzzle together isn't necessarily just talking to an elder who might have some pieces of information. How do we get it? How do we get it without breaking confidentiality or breaching somebody's privacy rights? NAP, the National Organization for Protective Services, views it a little differently. It's a systematic, methodical inquiry and examination of all components, circumstances, and relationships. So it's not just taking one person's word for something unless there's nobody else to talk to. If they substantiate the allegations, and again, we modified this a little bit, most cases that, or I should say probably almost all, that are substantiated for some form of abuse have to go into ongoing services. Now, again, there are going to be exceptions to that, but they have to run those exceptions through us as their regional manager. So my agencies would have to come to me and say, we want to substantiate for physical abuse, but we don't want to put into ongoing services, and these are the reasons. And I would say yes or no. Sometimes I agree with them and it doesn't go into ongoing. More often than not, I will say, I want you to try it a month in ongoing services just to see if you can do these 3 or 4 different things. And we want them to use that time to not just try and offer services, but to really build that rapport. If they got out of building rapport and having to run out to a home where an elder is yelling and screaming at them and trying to walk away, well, no, you need to try something different because they may accept a homemaker, they may accept some sort of services. So we want them to make every reasonable attempt, 1, to try and find an elder, and 2, to try and implement services if they're going to substantiate something. And with that, I will turn it back over to Taryn, who will talk about a wonderful topic that we have all workers really that they have to do.
Yeah, protective services is a balancing act. Not only is it putting that puzzle together, but once they put it together, what are we going to do? We do have a duty to protect the older adult, but we have to balance that with their right to self-determination if they have decisional capacity. These are adults, and we have to keep that in the forefront of what we're thinking. So what can we do in terms of intervention? There's casework information, we can offer them information, support, different referrals. We can kind of help them with advocacy issues. We can put in home care services, get them homemakers, personal care attendants, maybe adult day health, home delivered meals, lifeline. Sometimes in a physical abuse situation, the best thing we might be able to do is get a lifeline in. So at least if something happens, the older adult knows they have that button and they can push it. We have to help find emergency shelters. We talked earlier about putting in that money management. And sometimes it's respite or caregiver support and helping the caretaker do better to help the elder. We can also assist in applying for benefits in terms of food stamps, SSI, mass health, fuel assistance, and subsidized housing applications. So when we talk about referrals and advocacy, we do refer to legal services, a lot of community legal aid for housing issues. We can look for mental health or substance abuse services if they want them. Different medical services, a lot of times therapies or some kind of mental health treatment, alternative housing arrangements, whether it be housing or getting them into a rest home or assisted living if that's what they choose. And we do spend a lot of time, if we're unclear about the elder's capacity or we have concerns about it, we can make medical or capacity evaluations, try to get them in for those to be fully evaluated. So legal intervention, when the elder does lack decisional capacity, the situation may warrant the protective service agency to go to the court and we talked about a little bit earlier, get a protective order in order to talk to the elder safely, get a more thorough evaluation. And a lot of times it's to appoint a guardian or conservator because the elder just doesn't have the decisional capacity to make those decisions. And the only person that can say officially that they have that guardian or conservator and they can't make these decisions is if we take it to court. We can't do that internally in protective. We have to work with the medical professionals and bring it to the court for a legal determination. We talked a little bit about confidentiality. Confidentiality of the reporter, again, I can't stress this enough, is really maintained strongly. We want people to feel comfortable reporting. We would never want to ruin rapport if that mandated reporter has a good relationship with the elder. We wouldn't want to, get in the way of that or mess things up and put the elder more at risk. The identity of the mandated reporter or even non-mandated reporter may be divulged to the district attorney or other relevant government agency by court order if it's needed for prosecution or additional information from those entities. We did talk a little bit about the protective service records not being public record, but they can be released. The elder can request their records and other, there in certain ways records will be released. The identity of the reporter is going to be redacted from that report, not only just the name, but anything that would lead the person to know who the mandated reporter was. If there was a note that talked about 3 people being in a room, one of those was the mandated reporter, a lot of that note might be taken out so somebody couldn't infer who the mandated reporter was. We do take that very seriously. So like I said, they're not by law public records, so not everybody has access. Information collected as part of a case can only be released in certain circumstances, and it's very clearly outlined in our statutes and regulations. Data subjects are entitled to information held about them, but about them. They don't get the whole record. They have the ability to get stuff that's related to them themselves as data subjects, again, without the mandated reporter or non-mandated reporter's identity. We talked a little bit earlier about that change in the regulation. So we do have the ability to have this balancing test when discretionary release of information. Confidentiality to the elder is very important. This is a lot of sensitive material. We talked about that embarrassment and fear. So confidentiality is obviously very important in regards to the elder, not just the reporter. So the discretionary release of information does allow us to get or release, I should say, certain information if it's going to serve a compelling public interest and protect the health, safety, and welfare of others. So if somebody's behavior is putting the community at whole at risk, we have to balance, is there somebody we should be telling to protect, again, the health, safety, and welfare of others? For the purpose of conducting an effective investigation, sometimes we need to release a little bit more about what's happening to get feedback on why it's happening or, appropriate collateral's thoughts on what's happening. And for the effective protective services casework, we might need to give a little information, to get a little information or inform providers that are going in a little bit about the situation. But again, it is a balanced test, keeping the elders' confidentiality in the forefront of our minds. Again, it is set forth certain limitations that are very clear in the regulations. So it's really a fine balance of releasing what we need to help the older adult without breaking their confidentiality. So what are mandated reporters entitled to? Jonathan touched on this a little bit when we were talking about the process. If you are a mandated reporter and the report's going to be screened out by the ASAP or the Protective Service Agency, they should be making reasonable attempts to reach out to you via phone before they do that screening. Obviously, they have a regulatory window to which they need to screen the report, but they should be reaching out before they screen that out. That's to make sure you know that it's not being taken, so somebody's not looking at it, And sometimes there could be information that was just missed that you might have that they can then factor in and say, okay, never mind, I'm not screening this out. That was the piece of information we need. Like Jonathan said, the more information, the better. And if we can get those, which medications, it might be the factor whether they take it or they don't. They do have to document those attempts, and it is logged and tracked within the records. We have access to it at EUEA. There should be a follow-up letter indicating the screen out and reason. So you should get that in the mail if you provided your mailing address. At this point, it's there is some email or faxing with the current state of things. And when it's screened in, you're also going to letter, only this time it's going to tell you that it was screened in and who the worker who it assigned is. You should be getting a follow-up call from the assigned worker, to introduce themselves, see if you have any information. Something might have happened in between the reports and when the protective worker introduces themselves. So you should be getting that follow-up call, and you will get a notification letter sent within 45 days that the investigation was completed and whether it was substantiated or not substantiated. So some current things that we're looking at right now, I think, this isn't just with the older adult population, but an increase in domestic violence, complexity of the cases. Again, I was a worker for 10 years, and they're definitely getting more challenging as time goes on. Housing challenges are big. I think we'll talk about it in a little bit, but we're especially concerned about eviction cases that it might have been on hold through the pandemic. What's going to happen when the courts open up and all of those go through? Housing is difficult for seniors on a good day. Our protective workers don't have access to housing. We don't have our own housing buildings. So that is a huge challenge. Hoarding has always been a challenge. It's a very difficult population to work with. There's limited specialists to help deal with it. Substance abuse and mental health issues, obviously, if somebody doesn't think they have a problem or want help with that problem, it can be, a real challenge to trying to work with the elder. Right now, an increased risk for elders and workers. We had a pandemic, how to safely see them and get the information we need without putting anybody at any more risk. Need for collaboration among lots of agencies. If we don't know in protective what to do with the situation, who can we call? Who can we work with? It's never going to be the protective worker themselves that can fix or eliminate the abuse. We need to collaborate with more entities that can give us a little more help for the older adults. Increased medically and cognitively compromised elders. And I also feel like they're starting to become medically and cognitively compromised at a younger age. It used to be we got a lot of older adults in their 70s or 80s. Now it's a lot of in their 60s or 70s. And resources in general, not just for the older population, but for everyone, can be a challenge. So we talked about, if you're not reporting elder abuse, obviously that's the 1-800 number that we showed you earlier. If you have a concern about somebody who is 18 to 59 and disabled, you're going to report to the Disabled Persons Protection Commission. That's a lot of DMH, DMR, MRC. You would report those straight through them. Some people do report if the elder is over 60, and there is a little bit of a balance there. If they are over 60 and it falls under our jurisdiction, if you report there, it's going to come to us and we can take a look at it. The Department of Public Health, like we talked about, is any medical staff, nursing home staff concerned about the facility. That's going to be the Department of Public Health, and 18 and under is going to go to the Department of Children and Families. So questions?
I think there was a question in the questions and answers, differentiate between functional and decisional capacity. Functional capacity would be, what can you do physically? Can you cook for yourself? Can you do your personal care? Can you get your groceries? What is your functional ability? Physical functional, whereas decisional is going to be more your cognitive or mental health, which gets tricky because just because somebody has a mental health issue or a cognitive issue or even a diagnosis of dementia or Alzheimer's doesn't mean that they've lost their decisional capacity. And we'll talk a little bit more in the second part about how our workers are trained to assess that. And it's something that Taryn was part of the initial group that was trained in New York on kind of how to use this decisional capacity assessment tool. And really it's looking at the elder's ability to assess kind of the situation in general, or acknowledge and recognize the situation in general. And then can they see any risks associated with it? Do they know anybody who it's applied to? And then can they actually apply it to themselves? And at any one of those points, it can kind of fall apart. And that's really what decisional capacity is. And our workers are trained that if they can't assess decisional capacity and the level of risk is high or unknown, they have to get decisional capacity assessed. So they'll go to a doctor, they'll use one of the doctors they contract to go in and assess an elder. Because again, it's not, even if you think an elder has decisional capacity based on that tool, that's only a very small piece of it. And so you want to be careful walking away from something just because it looks like on paper they met the criteria. So that is definitely something that we keep an eye on. But both functional and decisional capacity are important related to how do we service an elder, how do we deal an elder, and how drastic do we need to get.
And it could really be as simple as they may not have the ability to make one important decision, where they live, but they can make all of their other decisions. So it's not always a blanket,
correct,
decisional capacity decision either. So it's tricky.
Correct. The other thing I wanted to add about the discretionary release is it's kind of opened the door a little bit. Prior to that, if we had an ethical issue, I know that an elder is driving unsafely, I can't force them to stop. They're competent. What do I do? Or they're smoking unsafely in housing and they're choosing not to stop. What do I do? And it was always that ethical decision of, do I breach confidentiality and tell housing or contact the police? And case by case basis, we were having to make those decisions. Well, now we have that as part of the regulations under the discretionary release. But one, the agencies have to come to us before they release information. Our general counsel has to make a ruling on it in some form or another. And it only applies to releasing information to government entities. And we're very cautious about releasing information to certain government entities. So, the one I'll give you an example on is we had an elder where the agency was paying for an elder to be in a nursing home long-term. So $7,000 a month the agency was paying. Medicaid, long-term Medicaid denied the elder because of financial exploitation. And what Medicaid came and did was they asked us for information. And so what we were able to do was, through the discretionary release, write a letter saying protective service substantiated for financial. It went to the DA. What they do with it is up to them. And Medicaid changed their ruling and approved the elder for long-term Medicaid, and did it somewhat retro, so the agency got some of its money back because they had paid for like a year and a half at $7,000 a month. So certainly we'll use it when we need to, but it's helped us handle or move through some of these difficult cases. Moving through the pandemic.
Hold on, Jonathan, we have one more.
Is there one more in the?
Yeah. As a court-based advocate, even after police involvement and the elder has been removed from certain abusive situations, should we file a protective service report? That is a good question. I would say if you know of an abuse and you think there could be some role for protective, I would always say I'd rather, like Jonathan said, I'd rather somebody doesn't slip through the cracks in a situation. There might not be a role at that time for protective, as there's not an immediate risk, but we would at least have the information. So should something change in a week, 2 weeks, and we get another report, we have the collective information. That's my personal opinion, because again, I'm with Jonathan, I'd rather somebody doesn't slip through the cracks and we have the information that we
I've been around for too long and have seen one too many things hit the media or be a problem because we didn't have the right systems in place. And so I think the best thing that you can do as advocates is, you don't know the ins and outs of what protective has done, hasn't done, file the report and let them make that decision on how to proceed. Because even if somebody is out of the abusive situation, it doesn't mean that that's going to last. I can think of a case right now where we have an elder that there's a permanent guardian in place, a family member is permanent guardian, and the plan is to move the elder out of state. Well, the problem is the elder is still in Massachusetts, and we don't want protective services closing the case, because then there are no eyes and ears there making sure that the move does happen and that the elder is safe long term. So we want to be very careful about things not falling through the cracks. And even with, a variety of professionals in the community, police, fire, and EMTs all respond to the home. They all think the other mandated reporters are going to file, and nobody files. So it gives a much broader picture of the situation, because everybody has a different viewpoint of the situation. So it's important to get those reports in, because that's that next step. And it also makes that connection for you. Even though protective services is mandated or is required to notify mandated reporters, as a non-mandated reporter, you can request certain information. What happened to the intake? What happened to the case? Which is what mandated reporters would get. But also as non-mandated during COVID, I can tell you that a lot of the agencies are making those phone calls if they're screening out reports, even though it's non-mandated and they're not required to. What one agency said to me is, it's good community relations. Why are we going to stop doing that and not do it for professionals who aren't mandated? That makes no sense. So, again, I think it makes that connection between you and protective services as much as we can, and then allows them to get more information moving forward. So for me in the pandemic, this is kind of how I have felt for the last year. I don't know if Taryn feels the same way. It's kind of, almost like hitting a moving target. And I think for those of you who work in the courts probably have felt the same way. We wanted to do a general highlight of where our program has been the last year, what we did initially, kind of how we see our program moving forward, and really what we've learned that we can implement longer term for our program. Despite what anybody else may tell you, protective services beginning last March was identified and remains an essential program as dictated by the governor of Massachusetts. So, it's not something where, okay, maybe we'll go out, we're in the same position as DCF is, or the other investigatory programs. We are not us at Elder Affairs, but our local programs are essential, which means they need to be doing their job. The question is, how do they do their job? And we'll talk more about that. But the essential identification allows them to drive around, even if everybody else has to stay home. If they get stopped, they can say we're protective services and we're supposed to be out doing things. The program did not shut down. Taryn and I developed the initial guidance, which we'll talk about a little bit. And it's amazing to hear from community professionals. We didn't know that you were still open for business. And, we're not going to shut down. We're not going to say, elders, you can be abused and nobody's going to do anything. So the program did not shut down. The goal of our program, as I outlined it before, did not change. We're still responsible for assessing and trying to remedy and prevent the abusive situation in the community. The problem is we've had to deal with a lot of other community professionals that may have changed practice or process, and how do we fit into that? The reporting process, though, didn't change. You call the hotline. The elder abuse hotline has remained open 24/7. The online system did not get pulled. There are times when the online system has gone down. I do apologize. It's not ours. There are times when our hotlines phones have gone down. Rare, but it does happen. And they have backup plan upon backup plan in place. But the hotline remained open 24/7. They're actually remote. They're still remote this day, but they have the ability as a setup to have their initial tier of assessing calls, their intake workers and supervisors. It's like they're all sitting in the office based on the setup that they have. So you wouldn't know that they're remote unless I told you they were. What we've had to really look for, as I mentioned before, is getting more information related to safety planning. we've always had to assess, and that's not necessarily something new going into homes. You need to know if there are environmental hazards. You need to know if there are weapons, unsecured weapons in the home. But asking those COVID questions is something that you're going to get quite a bit, and you may get multiple times, unfortunately. And I apologize, but there are reasons for it, not just from a comfort level, but we want to make sure that our staff are not going into a situation that they shouldn't be, or that they need to be taking certain precautions for. And again, certain medical issues, et cetera. Our numbers did decline. Taryn helped me on this. Overall, last April and May, our numbers did decline slightly. For the most part, they went back up, although each agency is a little bit different. I know the agency in Brockton, Old Colony, Elder Services, they're kind of up and down right now. They'll get 175, 200 one month, and then they'll dip to maybe 120 the next month. And we're really not able to kind of figure out the pattern or why, but the numbers will go up. It may take a while for the numbers to go up. There's still a lot of individuals in the community that are isolating. So as Taryn said, as things open up a little bit more, we'll inevitably see those reports going back up. And as I mentioned before, the hotline staff are still remote. Most of our agencies are still remote as well, but are operating as essential programs. With that, since Taryn kind of felt the brunt of, the agency's not liking our interim plan, I got to write it and then kind of hand it off to Taryn, who got yelled at. So I'll give it to her to look at or go over with you.
Which was interesting, because in the first half of the pandemic, I worked at a protective service agency as a director. And then the second half of the pandemic, I've been at the Executive Office of Elder Affairs. So it's given me some good perspective and made not everybody a big fan. But yeah, it was home visits and in-person elder interviews. Our regulations and, just ethical best practices are, you see the elder in their home, you get a sense of the environment, the elder, who they are, where they're at, what things look like. This is a regulatory requirement, but we needed, especially at the beginning, to protect our elders and our staff and others in the community. As we know, older adults were in a much higher risk category. Workers didn't want to bring something to an elder. It was a lot of figuring out the best way to keep everybody safe. As home care staff and all of that kind of dropped off, and there was some concern at the beginning. We didn't need the protective staff going down being sick either. So each case required, do they need the visit? Do we need to see the elder or the home, and the reasons why or why not? If it's an elder that we know and it's a financial case and there's no concerns about the home condition, that wouldn't have been a priority visit for the protective worker, especially in the beginning of last year. Information that was potentially missing with no visit. Also sometimes, we say, okay, that's not a high priority to go to the home because they say it's fine. We all know that sometimes we get to a home that we think is going to be fine and it's not. And we looked at, why do we need to go there, or why don't we? How is it going to impact our investigation? Are there others going into the home? Do they still have the homemaker or family members or a visiting nurse? And then there had to be a careful and thought out plan regarding PPE, visits outside, at windows, whatever it was, before the worker went out into the field. So again, home visits and in-person interviews, they did continue. We encouraged creative ways to see an elder. As you can see there, kind of what the nursing homes did. Could they see them through a window? Was there an outside porch? Could they meet them in a parking lot if both the elder and the worker drived? I actually had one worker that she was on her cell phone, the elder was on his cell phone, and they parked next to each other so she could see him and his kind of physical reactions to the questions and how he looked, but they were both safe. Set up chairs outside. Thankfully March and April was a little cold, but we got into the summer months, so outside was a big option. And then use of technology. We have a lot of younger elders, like I talked about. Could we use Zoom or FaceTime or the million other programs that seem to have popped up since March of last year? So we really had to be creative in how we were seeing the elders while keeping the protective workers and the elders safe. Collateral interviews. So again, we need to talk to our collaterals. It's critical to assess the situation. Everybody has a version of their story, like Jonathan talked about earlier, and putting it all together and finding that middle completed puzzle is important. Pre-COVID, most were done by phone, just out of convenience. People work, however it could be done. So they could continue to do the interviews by phone. Rare instances where they did need to be interviewed in person. It could be at the workplace. We may have needed to pick up something. There may have been something that we needed to go over with that collateral, kind of in person. But again, the record needed to show the reason. There were no other options, that the agency itself, higher ups, had approved it, and indicate which safety precautions they were taking. Social distancing, 6 feet, masks, gloves, face shields, whatever they were doing at the time. Alleged perpetrator interviews are also key. Obviously we want to get that person's side of the story. It can often be a big component of our investigation. There's no regulatory requirement to conduct in-person interviews with APs. Sometimes it can be a dangerous situation. They can be volatile. They're kind of being, accused of something, and they're not always happy. But they do present another side to the story that we need to complete the puzzle. So, we were already assessing risk in terms of whether it was domestic violence, substance abuse, or severe mental health. How would we safely interview that person with also not putting the elder at risk? You don't want to call somebody who has substance abuse issues, talk to them on the phone, and then hang up and they're alone with the elder. So there's always been a kind of safety plan around that. But again, if it needed to be in person for some reason, it had to, again, the same thing, reflect the reason, no other options. Management had to approve it, and we had to know what they were doing, what safety precautions were taken. So then we had interview for decisional abilities. Again, I'm one of the first people to train this in the state. And this was a huge change for us, as one of the components of this interviewing for decisional abilities, or I'm going to call IDA, is assessing the elder's body language to the questions and the, being asked. So to have to transfer that to now doing it over the phone to talk to an elder, there were a lot of tricky components here. But it's the key piece in assessing the elder's decisional capacity. They're trained to use a certain tool. It starts with, like Jonathan had mentioned earlier, do they understand globally that eviction is a thing, that older adults can be evicted? Do they understand that they could be evicted and they're at risk of the eviction? And do they have a plan can they weigh the pros and cons of a plan to fix it? So we get some general idea of, do they understand the situation they're in, and can they make a decision regarding this situation? So again, a huge component of the tool is elders' physical response to those questions, because we all know body language is key. And if somebody, tucks into themselves or shuts down while you're asking some of these questions, they may say yes, but their body says no. There are definitely things you need to look at with body language, and we couldn't get that done over the phone. So we needed to move forward quickly and come up with a plan. And again, things don't always go as planned.
No. And I guess support us. At no point in time did we say, you don't do a visit. You assess the need for the visit, and with the IDA that you're assessing over the phone. And I'll leave you, and it's a case that I've used as an example for almost the last year, where they chose not to go out to see this elder. There were concerns about unsafe smoking. They called him on the phone. He said everything is fine. They didn't look for other things or other ways, ask any other questions. And he wound up setting himself on fire, unfortunately, and lost his arm from the elbow down or one arm, elbow down, and several fingers on the other hand due to his unsafe smoking. And in looking at this case more closely, if protective services had gone out, they would have seen the signs and symptoms of unsafe smoking, the burn holes, etc. They may not have been able to change the elder if he was competent, or had decisional abilities, but they didn't even take that step to say, do we need a visit to assess the environment? And so, it's one of those situations where, I think agencies have begun to understand, okay, I can't get everything over the phone. I have to go out. And as Taryn said, we're really looking for creative ways for them to do that. The problem with that, as we got into our interim plan and still to this day, is there's a whole lot more to our job than just home visits and interviews with other people. So we've had to adjust and modify things kind of on the fly sometimes. One of the biggest problems that we've had is their elders, whether they're in elder housing, hospital, assisted living, or a nursing home, were not being allowed to go into nursing homes. And so what we've really had to do with our programs is help them understand that they're not just general family visitors, they're essential personnel. And technically, unless there's a COVID outbreak in a facility, they are supposed to be able to get in. And, we have to kind of figure out a way to do that. Sometimes, pushing, we've gotten like a nursing home to cave. Sometimes they've done the visit outside when it's been warm enough. So there are a variety of ways to do it. But, when we hear visitors aren't allowed, well, that we're not visitors. We're, kind of doing regulatory identified investigation. So we really try and work with those facilities to set up safe and effective visits. And as I said, really look at the visit in a different way. Even if it's just for 5 minutes, going and eyeballing the elder and then doing the rest of it on the phone, seeing them in their environment for 5 minutes may give you a whole lot of information. In doing this presentation, I broke this out intentionally, more so for whatever help you can provide to our agencies. I think they would love it. The courthouse changes, and while I understand the changes completely and the reasons for them, it has presented significant problems for our programs. There are some courts that are not even allowing protective orders to go through, although I did see an emergency order the other day. They're extending guardianships indefinitely. You keep extending it so the guardian really can't do a whole lot, but you're extending it so you don't have to have all the players in there for a trial, or whatever you need to do, you can't do it on a Zoom meeting. So the pace has been slower. Protective cases are staying open a whole lot longer because we just can't get to the point where we're comfortable resolving them. And we're talking, several years for some of these cases. They're just getting dragged out and dragged out. The other problem is if the courts are not allowing, or the judges are not allowing emergency orders for our program means we're not providing that initial notification, usually with a protective order, but you can do it with guardianship as well. The problem is if you're not using it that way and you're having to notify the players, including the elder and the alleged perpetrator, you're putting that elder at greater risk. You're giving that perpetrator the time to take all the money out of the bank. You're giving them the time to disappear. And it's not uncommon to have those kind of happen that way. One of my first cases as a supervisor, almost 30 years ago, they wouldn't allow the emergency order, and they had us all in court. And they said to the alleged perpetrator, who was a career criminal, are you going to adhere to this and let them evaluate your mother-in-law? And he said, sure, no problem. He walked out of the courtroom and disappeared with the elder. And so, those are the situations that are really starting to happen again. And Protective Services is feeling stuck because they don't know what to do. And they feel like they need to proceed legally, but at the same time, to do so may put an elder at greater risk. And so ultimately, we can't control what the judges and the courts decide to do, but certainly it's something to keep in mind because it is affecting our program and our effectiveness in moving cases forward. Well-being checks don't seem to be a problem much anymore, but early on in the pandemic, police certainly were still responding to 911 calls, but Protective Services was trying to use police to do some well-being checks. and still may use them after hours in particular, rather than going into a home at 2 o'clock in the morning. And many police departments were concerned about the safety of their own officers. And so there was a struggle to get those done. Again, I'm not hearing that as an issue as much anymore, but it was. Anytime we have to get medical or financial documents and do that in person, is the bank open? Can you walk in and get that? How do you make those arrangements? As silly as it sounds, our agency's business processes have had to change. They're not, if their office is closed, how are they faxing things out? How are they printing? We're remote as well. I have to go into Boston if I want to print something because I don't have a printer at home. Mailing letters, we've given them permission to email things that we wouldn't normally do. So again, looking at that, I have several of my agencies actually complaining to me quite a bit about record requests. They're still doing it, but to make the copies, to do the redaction off-site is very, very difficult. And to go in, can they go in? What are the safety precautions they need to use when going in? So that's been an issue. There's certainly been an increased concern for caregivers for elders, especially with the elders who have some level of cognitive dysfunction or decline and don't understand the importance of wearing a mask, don't understand social distancing, don't understand they just can't walk around looking for their son's restaurant, no cares in the world. And so, I think caregiver stress has gone up significantly. And service implementation, most adult day healths are open again, or open on some level, but in-home services has definitely been an issue. Taryn mentioned earlier the eviction. We're waiting for the flood. There is a way around kind of that moratorium where, if it's an emergency or if it's putting other people at risk, you can still move forward with the eviction, but there's a backlog and it's going to, I guess we all hope it's going to go away, but it's going to explode and we're going to have a lot of elders who are out of housing very quickly. The wait lists for housing are significantly long in Boston. You could be talking 10 to 20 year wait list to get into elder housing, which again sounds excessive, but for some of these communities, we can't get them into housing. And having an eviction on your record on top of that, you're not going to get into housing most times anyway. And so we're really concerned about what the next maybe 6 months is going to hold in terms of housing issues for older adults. Unemployment, certainly if a son, loses his job, he can't pay the mortgage, can't pay his rent, and moves back in. So how is unemployment for anybody and everybody affecting the situation? We have seen more of that isolation. We do still see a lot of elders who are uncomfortable leaving the home for any long periods of time, or family members who are in the home, and again, were isolated. How is that domestic violence situation playing out? Where is that stress level going? Service providers in some parts of the state can't find workers to go in, as simple as it sounds, to do homemaking or to do personal care, which is increasing the stress level, increasing the level of risk for elders who can't have their needs met. We can't place them in nursing homes because they don't meet the criteria, and you don't want to put somebody in a nursing home because they don't have a homemaker. But how do you deal with the risk situation that you're facing based on the service provision issue? And then, as I said, cognitive issues. Those of us who most days think we're cognitively intact, although some days I question myself now, but with that cognitive decline, they're not getting, the restrictions. They're not understanding it, and it's becoming very, very frustrating for communities to deal with and for families to deal with. So the question is, what have we learned? A whole lot. We've learned the whole important part of planning, and it sounds silly. We've always had the requirement that investigations or agencies have to do investigation plans and think things through. But this has really put them in a position where you don't just run out. You have to kind of sit down. Even if it's an emergency, you have to sit down and say, what makes the most sense? What steps am I going to take or not take? Because if I don't do that, It may have been, 2 years ago, I get attacked by that dog that's there. Now it's a whole other host of things. And it could be that nobody knows what's going on inside that home. And so level of risk is a concern because of that. But it's also helped our programs really identify the importance of planning throughout the life of a case. It's not a once and done at the beginning of a case. It happens throughout. And it's also allowed us to be, extremely creative. I'm not the most technically astute, but seeing our agencies, providing tablets where they're going out for the elders that understand how to use the tablet. They're putting it in, Ziploc bags, putting it on the door. The elders are taking it out, communicating with the worker through the tablet. So again, you have that distance, putting it back in the Ziploc bag, putting it back on their doorknob, and the agency's picking up the tablets and sanitizing them when they get back. So again, it's kind of thinking outside the box, because if we don't think about situations differently than we've ever done before, then we're going to be putting a lot of people or leaving a lot of people at risk. So it's really put us to the test, and it's a challenge, but I think it's helped quite a few agencies, especially from the technology perspective. What can they use to communicate with people in cases, and how do they actually do the job the same way they might have done otherwise? We can do work remote. I'm going crazy sitting at home. I like to see, Taryn's never been even in the office with any of us. So, but anybody who's kind of seen our office, we'll yell over the partitions to each other, we'll talk to each other because that's the setup, and it's not the same. You have to pick up the phone, you have to call people through Teams. And so for many of us, it's become more difficult, but we can do the job. And protective services agencies can do the job as well. Guardianship programs can do the job as well. And it can be effective. They can do this remote for long periods of time. It's not something that we have to kind of go back to everybody being in the office on a regular basis, because it's not going to happen. It's not going to be safe. And we've shown that we can do that. But our success is only dependent on communication and collaboration. I say this at every training that I've done for close to 30 years. We have to respect the privacy and confidentiality guidelines, but these cases are so much more difficult now that if we don't find a way to work with our community partners, then elders are going to be left at risk. That's the bottom line. And so, I think that's become the key piece is, how do we continue with that communication and collaboration when everybody's remote, and then build on that moving forward. With that, I'll turn it back over to Taryn.
So moving forward, we do have a lot of, like Jonathan said, creative tools, and I think that some of them are going to continue to be implemented, because we have to look at the new normal. Don't love that term, but we have to look at it going forward. We still need to be meeting regulatory guidelines, ensuring we're getting all of the information we need and moving the cases along, at a decent pace, and planning. I think, like Jonathan said, there was always those cases where you should have maybe planned a little more, but you just kind of went out there because it was, the flow of the job. I think that they're learning how important planning can be. No planning can lead to, not having success at a visit, taking more of your time, not getting the information you need, or again, putting the elder at risk or even the worker. If you don't take the time to plan, if there's dogs, is there a safe place to meet? Should I go out to this home? So I think the new normal is getting back to those regulatory guidelines where we're going out and seeing people, but still spending that time focusing on the plan on how to do it safe. Again, not all of our elders are vaccinated. Not all of them will be. There still needs to be a balance of making sure everyone is safe, the situation's safe, and spend a little more time planning how to do this investigation. And I think that was a great lesson learned from, kind of the last year. So again, there's no cookie cutter approaches to protective for anything. Every case is very different, and you have to be creative. Some elders on the 10th floor of housing, you can't meet outside. The tablet might be a better idea for privacy, but not to be in the smaller apartments. But again, like Jonathan said, collaboration is really, really huge. You know, if there's an elder that we can't get out to see, but we have, you know, a nurse diligently going in there daily for med management, can we coordinate with them? It's always been critical for us in collaborating with other agencies, but again, now, due to, you know, everything that's going on, the health risks, and there are limitations on resources, like Jonathan said, some areas are really having a hard time even finding homemakers, and the stress of the situation, whether it be due to the pandemic or the job loss or everything, our elders are stressed, our collaterals are stressed. You know, we even know that our, you know, the agencies we're trying to collaborate with are stressed, and, you know, it's causing our workers to be stressed too. So really working together to make sure the elder is, you know, at the forefront and safe, and putting in everything we can put in as a team without, you know, overexposure or doing too much to put the elder at risk, is really what we're looking at now. Continuing to use those tablets, you know, the meeting outside, it's getting nice again. We can do outdoor visits again. It's really learning what worked. And I think even after the risk of the pandemic, some of these things are still going to be very important. You know, is it easier for the elder to talk alone with a tablet in another room than a worker coming to sit on the couch with other family there? So it's really using these things, working with the other agencies to see what information did they know. Can we answer some of their questions? Can we work together on this? And really taking these lessons forward through the foreseeable future. So with that, any questions?
I know we're a couple minutes over, but certainly, you know, we'll stay if you have any questions, or you have our names. You know, we're on the state email address or in the address book. So, you know, certainly if you think of anything after the fact, you can definitely call us or email us. And, you know, I can speak for myself. I tend not to give my work cell number out, only because some of the people that get it, I don't want to talk to. So, but, you know, if you need to talk about something, you know, send us an email and we can certainly connect by phone at that point if we need to.
Thank you, Jonathan and Taryn. This was really, really informative. If there are any last minute questions, please do use the Q&A function. And like Jonathan said, you can also reach out to them if you have questions after the fact. We'll be sharing these slides via email with everyone who attended today, along with that document that they referenced at the beginning of the presentation that has all of the other protective services agencies in the state.